In the early 2000s, a real estate developer in Brazil approached the mayor of a mid-sized city with a proposal that seemed almost too good to be true. He owned, he said, thousands of hectares of prime development land on the outskirts of the city, land that was perfectly positioned for residential development, land that could accommodate tens of thousands of new homes for the city's growing population, land that he was willing to develop in partnership with the municipal government at favorable terms. The mayor was interested. The city council was interested. The banks were interested. The construction companies were interested. And most importantly, the families who needed homes were interested. Contracts were signed. Permits were issued. Construction loans were approved. Workers were hired. Concrete was poured. Roads were built. Infrastructure was installed. Thousands of families paid deposits on homes that were under construction on land that was being actively developed. There was one problem. He did not own the land. Not technically, not legally, not in any sense that would survive a title search conducted by someone who was actually trying to find the truth, rather than confirm what they had already been told. The land had owners. Multiple owners. None of them were him. Some of the land belonged to the state government. Some belonged to indigenous communities with protected territorial rights. Some belonged to private individuals who had no idea their property was being sold to home buyers. By the time the truth emerged, hundreds of millions of reais had changed hands. Thousands of families had paid for homes they would never receive or would eventually be forced to vacate. Banks had extended construction loans against collateral that did not belong to the borrower. Municipal governments had issued permits based on documentation that was fraudulent, and the developer who had convinced an entire city to build on land he did not own had moved on to the next city. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how this fraud was constructed, why so many sophisticated institutions failed to catch it, and why the same fundamental mechanism has been used in real estate frauds across Brazil, across Latin America, and across the world for generations. This is the story of land fraud, and the man who sold what was not his to sell. To understand how land fraud of this scale is possible, you need to understand something about land title systems in Brazil and in much of the developing world that is counterintuitive to anyone who grew up in a country with a comprehensive and reliable land registry. In many developed countries, particularly in Western Europe and North America, land title systems are relatively reliable. When you buy a property, a title search will generally reveal its true ownership history. Title insurance exists to protect buyers against errors in that history. The system is not perfect, but it is robust enough that large-scale fraud based on selling land you do not own is extremely difficult to execute. In Brazil, particularly in the decades before the digital modernization of land registry systems, the situation was dramatically different. Land registry functions were divided among thousands of municipal cartórios, registry offices that operated with significant autonomy, inconsistent standards, and limited coordination with each other. A piece of land in a developing area might have competing claims registered in different cartórios. Indigenous territorial rights might be recorded in federal systems that municipal registries did not cross-reference. State land boundaries might be disputed and inadequately documented. Into this environment of systematic ambiguity, a sophisticated fraudster could insert false documentation with extraordinary effectiveness. The documentation needed to sell land did not need to withstand scrutiny by a determined investigator. It needed only to look authentic to buyers, bankers, and municipal officials who were not specifically looking for fraud and who had institutional incentives to approve transactions rather than question them. The specific fraud that became the template for the most destructive Brazilian land schemes of the early 2000s involved a technique that Brazilian investigators eventually called land laundering, a term deliberately parallel to money laundering. Just as money laundering involves passing illegal funds through legitimate financial channels to disguise their origin, land laundering involves passing fraudulent ownership claims through legitimate-seeming documentary processes to create the appearance of valid title. The process began with the identification of target land. The ideal target was land in a gray zone of ownership, land whose status was genuinely ambiguous, where competing claims existed, where the original documentation was old and unclear, where the legitimate owners were either institutional and therefore slow to respond, or were ordinary people without the resources to defend their rights aggressively. The Cerrado regions of central Brazil, the peripheral areas of rapidly growing cities, the coastal zones where tourism development was creating demand, all of these were productive hunting grounds for the land fraudster. Once target land was identified, the fraudster needed to create or acquire documentation suggesting ownership. This documentation took various forms: fabricated registry entries, historical documents that purported to show a chain of title leading to the fraudster, judicial decisions from corrupt or careless courts recognizing ownership claims, administrative acts from municipal or state governments that could be interpreted as conferring rights. The sophistication of the documentation varied with the sophistication of the fraud and the corruption available for purchase. With documentation in hand, the fraudster approached municipalities. The pitch was almost always the same. I own this land. I want to develop it. I need permits and infrastructure support. I am willing to share the development in ways that benefit the city. For mayors under pressure to show development, to provide housing, to generate tax revenue, the proposal was appealing. The documentation looked legitimate. The developers seemed credible. Due diligence was cursory. Permits were issued. Once permits existed, the fraud entered its most productive phase. Banks would lend against permitted development projects. Construction companies would sign contracts. Home buyers would pay deposits. The documentation chain, fraudulent at its root, was now being reinforced by layers of legitimate institutional activity that gave it the appearance of solidity. The specific case that became the most studied and in some ways the most brazen example of this fraud in Brazil involved a man operating in multiple cities in the interior of São Paulo state and Minas Gerais in the early 2000s. He was charismatic, well-connected, apparently successful. He drove expensive cars. He had offices in multiple cities. He employed teams of salespeople. He attended business events and municipal development conferences. He presented himself as exactly what the growing Brazilian interior needed: a private sector partner who could unlock housing development at scale. His documentation was elaborate. He had thick folders of registry documents, judicial decisions, surveys, environmental licenses. The documents had been assembled over years, some genuine and some fraudulent, layered together in a way that made the entire package appear coherent and credible. A lawyer asked to review the documentation quickly would typically find nothing obviously wrong. The fraud was in the details, in the cross-referencing that would have revealed that the chain of title was broken, that some of the foundational documents were fabricated, that the land described in the ownership papers was not the same land being developed. The banks that approved construction loans against this fraudulent documentation had internal processes that should have caught the problems. Title searches were required. Legal opinions were obtained, but the title searches were conducted by local lawyers who often lacked the resources or the incentive to conduct thorough investigations. The legal opinions were based on the documentation provided by the borrower. Nobody went to the land and talked to the actual people living on or using it. Nobody contacted the federal agencies with competing claims. Nobody pulled the original registry entries from the foundational cartorio rather than relying on certified copies provided by the borrower. The municipal officials who issued permits operated under similar informational constraints and similar institutional pressures. They were not conducting fraud investigations. They were processing permit applications. The application looked complete. The documentation looked legitimate. The development looked like exactly the kind of project the city needed. The permit was issued. By the time construction was underway, the fraud had achieved a kind of institutional momentum. Multiple legitimate actors, banks, construction companies, home buyers, municipal governments, were now invested in the project. Each of them had conducted some form of due diligence and found nothing obviously wrong. The collective validation of these institutions made individual participants less likely to raise questions. If the bank approved the loan, the construction company signed the contract. If the city issued the permit, the bank approved the loan. Each institution relied implicitly on the due diligence of the others, creating a circle of mutual reinforcement that the fraudulent documentation had successfully penetrated. The collapse began differently in different cases. Sometimes it began when the actual landowners, discovering that their property was being developed by someone they had never heard of, contacted authorities. Sometimes it began when indigenous rights organizations conducting territorial surveys found construction underway on protected land. Sometimes it began when a competing development project caused a more careful title search that revealed the conflicting claims. Sometimes it began when the developer, having collected enough from one project, disappeared before delivering the promised homes, and the resulting complaints triggered investigation. However it began, the unraveling was always catastrophic for the victims and complex for the legal system. The families who had paid deposits faced the loss of their savings and in some cases, their actual homes, because some projects reached completion before the fraud was discovered, leaving buyers in possession of houses built on land to which they had no secure title. The banks faced losses on construction loans secured by fraudulent collateral. The construction companies faced unpaid contracts. The municipal governments faced political crises and legal liability. The legal response was hampered by the complexity of the fraud and the number of jurisdictions involved. Land disputes in Brazil involve federal, state, and municipal authorities simultaneously. Indigenous territorial claims involve federal agencies. Environmental licenses involve state agencies. Registry disputes involve the cartorio system and its supervisory courts. Criminal charges for fraud involve the state or federal prosecution system, depending on which laws were violated. Coordinating all of these authorities against a single fraud was enormously difficult and time-consuming. The developer himself, having anticipated the collapse, had typically moved significant assets offshore or into the names of family members before the fraud was discovered. The Brazilian legal system's ability to pierce corporate veils and recover assets from related parties was limited in this period. The investigation took years. The prosecution took more years. The recovery of funds for victims was partial at best. What made this category of fraud so persistent was the combination of factors that made it easy to execute and difficult to prosecute. The ambiguity of land title in developing areas provided the raw material. The institutional pressure to approve development provided the opening. The complexity of the legal response provided the time to extract value before accountability arrived. And the availability of corrupt or careless intermediaries at every stage of the process, lawyers, surveyors, notaries, municipal officials, provided the human infrastructure the fraud required. Brazil has made significant improvements to its land title systems since the worst of these frauds. The digital integration of registry systems has reduced but not eliminated the opportunities for fraudulent documentation. The development of online title search capabilities has made cursory due diligence less acceptable. Federal coordination of competing land claims has improved. The indigenous territorial mapping program has documented rights that were previously vulnerable to fraudulent development. But the fundamental conditions that create the opportunity for land fraud have not been eliminated in Brazil or in most of the developing world. Ambiguous title in rapidly developing areas remains a reality. Institutional pressure to approve development remains powerful. The complexity of the legal response continues to provide the fraudster with a significant head start before accountability arrives. The families who bought homes on land he did not own are still navigating the consequences of that fraud. Some have secure title after years of litigation. Some are still uncertain. Some lost everything. The developer who convinced an entire city to build on land he did not own was eventually convicted of crimes. The sentence was reduced on appeal. The assets that could be recovered were a fraction of what was. He convinced a city, multiple cities, and the concrete they poured on land he did not own is still standing. If you believe the public deserves to know where the money actually goes, subscribe. Every week, we cover the frauds, the scandals, and the financial crimes the system wants you to forget.